So my name is Michael Reinhardt. I am a physical therapist as well as a strength coach. I work at a place called Rehab to Perform in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I have a history of working with Olympic weightlifters, field sport athletes, and I also was blessed to actually do an internship with Rufus over here during my time at iFast. So very happy to be on. I'm looking forward to some good conversation today.
Today I changed it up a little bit. I love fresh squeezed orange juice. So at Fresh Time, they have fresh squeezed orange juice, right? So I put that in, the orange juice, and then I put olive oil in it and drink it. And I really like it.
Olive oil and orange juice. It's an interesting
Yep.
combo.
Are there any other happy liquids in there that we should know about?
No. That's it.
One, just like kind of what load management means to you, because I know it's kind of a term that gets thrown around a lot. And then how you are regulating that when you have more of like a rehab situation versus a training situation, and if that's any different.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I mean, broad strokes. I mean, load management to me is essentially like, how am I tracking this person's dosage over a long period of time? So in the real world setting, like it's not going to be a perfect science. It's great when you have the research that has like an exact set volume, but in general, I'm looking for trends over time. So a lot of people will talk about things like acute chronic workload. They'll talk about like total volume over a period of whether it's a week or a month. But in my mind, it's essentially like, what intensity and what dosage am I giving this person over a set period of time? So an easy way to think about it for me is like the micro of like 1 week at a time, and then the macro of like every month or even every cycle, which might be a couple months. So essentially, like, how do I track how much weight they're moving, at what percentages, and obviously what is their response to those things? So load management in a nutshell is, how do they manage stress? So what are the buckets of stress that I'm loading this person with? And the understanding that it's not just training, it's also life stress. So a lot of people forget the other end of the equation of, if you have a lot of stuff going on, like you're not sleeping well, you're not managing it well, you have a lot of stuff going on at work, your load management strategies are probably gonna be a lot different versus if it's your entire life. And I'd love to get some of Rufus's comments of this too. Like, imagine if you're working with a competitive athlete who their life is their training versus an individual who's coming to you potentially for, say they're like a high school athlete, or say they're a college athlete, or even just somebody like in the rehab setting, somebody who's coming to me with a knee injury, any injury, but they're trying to get back to some level of athletic ability or some level of recreation. So it's essentially like, how do I take all of these stressors that are coming to this individual, and how do I help modify them based on what they're tolerating? So going to that, it's essentially like, it's an experiment. You give them a stimulus, you give them a stressor within your setting, you see how they respond to it over a given period of time. And if it's too much, you have to kind of titrate the load a little bit. You have to pull things back, you have to add things in. So, I mean, macro standpoint, like, load management is a lot more simple than people actually give it credit for, because in reality, all you're doing is you're taking a set period of time, you're giving them a certain amount of work in that time, and you see how they respond to it. If you're seeing trends that are in a positive direction, keep loading them. That kind of comes to linear periodization. Versus if they're downtrending, or if they're having exacerbation, or they're just not performing well, you've got to either reevaluate your system, or you got to pull back a little bit.
Very good.
Cool. Let's kind of work through the spectrum here and start in more like an acute setting where you have pain as obviously more of an influence than more down the line. How accurate can your metrics be if you have pain as this kind of like noisy thing that is kind of hard to track and figure out exactly what's going on?
Yep. I mean, that's a great question. I think in the acute setting, you have to rely a lot more on like your subjective metrics of like, what is this person telling you? How does it feel? How they're responding to it? So with the acute type settings, like say somebody just had a back injury and they still want to do weightlifting, or they still want to do running, you might have to give them like these parameters of like, hey, it's okay if you feel a little bit, but it can't go beyond this certain amount. So from there, your load management metrics in that regard is essentially like, what is their tolerance to this activity? And I'm going to piggyback on some of the stuff that Derek Hansen talks about. He talks a lot about like building tolerance, like early on in the phase, even when there's some symptoms. As long as it's not getting significantly worse, you're probably in an okay realm. I mean, keep in mind, we're often dealing with athletes, we're dealing with active individuals. We don't want to tell them to stop doing everything, because otherwise they're going to get detrained very quickly. I mean, think about the early phases of rehab. It's somebody who's probably going to drastically change their training volume. So how do we keep it as high as possible while respecting those physiological and like physical stress variables, being tissue healing times, like acute pain states, things like that. Because if we do too much too soon, they're going to get overloaded. But if we give them time to recover, then we can kind of build up this more progressive amount of load over time.
Let's fast forward now to more out of the acute phase of rehab. So again, you have like your athletes who are going to be more regimented, and you have your like Gen Pop who a little more just kind of like lifestyle stuff going on, things like that. So you have pain in the acute phase. How do your variables in terms of what you're tracking, in terms of load management, change once you get out of that acute pain phase and now you want to just start dosing things up more and more and more?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess in my mind that it's a gradual shift. Like you're not one day going to be acute and the next day you're going to be like, okay, we're good to train. But it's going to be this gradual progression where they start focusing less and less on their pain and you start focusing more on their function. So this is when you're looking at more of your physical deficits. Like, does this person have limitations in their motion? Does this person have limitations in their strength or their power, or even just their tolerance to the amount of loading? In most cases, once you get out of that acute pain state, you have individuals they're just limited, right? It's more of their physical capacities that are impaired versus their more psychological. So in that regard, it's essentially like, now I'm looking at more than the numerical values of what sort of load am I actually giving them. So how quickly am I progressing them in terms of how much weight they're lifting, or how many sets and reps am I giving them? So it's more of like your physiological adaptations. So at this point, like they're out of the acute pain state, they probably had some sort of atrophy. They probably had some sort of rate of force development and some neural deficits compared to before the injury. So now is where we start focusing on those sorts of parameters in terms of how do I produce force more quickly? How do I absorb force more quickly? How do I make sure they have a lot of time in these given positions? So instead of doing maybe the early on like slow tempo work, maybe we're start adding in more velocity based stuff. Maybe we're adding in more quick force absorption based stuff. If you're dealing with your field sport athletes, this is where you're starting to get into more of your like deceleration, acceleration type stuff, because hopefully they're out of that initial phase where you have to be very careful with healing times. And now it's more into training. So it's kind of this cool continuum where you go from like the acute phase where you have to be the most careful because you're trying to let everything, like you're letting homeostasis take over. You're letting the body kind of use its own mechanisms to recover. And then from there, you just start using more of your training principles to gradually progress them. I mean, I think I might be dumbing it down more than it needs, as much as it can be, but it makes sense because then you just look at what sort of demands does this person have? So say it's just your recreational individual who wants to feel good. You probably don't have to do anything super high velocity, but you might want to expose them to basic things like, hey, if you step off a curb wrong, can you catch yourself? Or hey, if you have to pick up your grandkid, can you do that? So that's where the benefit of like doing these like full body strength and function, quote unquote, functional movements comes into play. And I think that's one of the rehab points that I think is often missed. We do a great job of getting people out of pain, but we almost always forget about like, hey, what else can we do for them? Or what's the further end of the spectrum? Like I always identify as a strength coach first, but with a background as a physical therapist. So how do I use my skills as a PT to get somebody moving better? And then I use my skills as a coach to help them move with better competency, with better capacity, right? Working on more of those physical and performance parameters.